Final Fantasy XIII was controversial. The sky is blue, and Bethesda and From Software should optimize their games better. Obvious things are obvious. Final Fantasy XIII was a game that critics were pretty happy with, fans most prominently loathed, and yet it sold extremely well for the series. Despite kind of being a failure, regardless of its quality, it was still a success financially, or at least we can assume it was. The big question mark with that statement relates to the engine that it was built upon. Crystal Tools, or the White Engine, was supposed to prop up the whole Fabula Nova Crystallis set of games. However, development struggles with Final Fantasy XIII, due to the demands of HD gaming, forced them to delay the game, push back and rework Agido 13 until it became Type 0, and push back the development of Versus 13 even further, until it eventually transformed into Final Fantasy XV. You see, Crystal Tools was really great at housing enclosed, high-detail environments, with equally detailed characters, animations, effects, and more. It wasn't, however, particularly great at handling open areas, as can be seen by the performance in 13 once you get to Pulse. This necessitated creating an entirely new engine from the ground up for Versus 13, because its whole thing was being an open-world Final Fantasy with extremely grand scale on display. Doing so was going to be expensive though, and when Square had already spent so much money on Crystal Tools and only had one major title to show for it, they had to think of something else that could recoup those costs. In comes Final Fantasy XIII-2, and eventually Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII, two unexpected direct sequels to the original 13 title. As unexpected sequels, you might think that they feel messy, uninspired, or like complete non sequiturs. But honestly, both games are a lot better than even a lot of people who hated 13 expected. Unlike with Final Fantasy XIII, I don't need to go through the controversy and the massive mess of fan expectations here. Expectations for the sequel were already rock bottom for the people who hated the original game and the trilogy, and to the surprise of many, the development, which was handed off to the developer of games like the Star Ocean series and the underrated Radiata Stories, Triace, took a lot of the criticism of 13 into account, directly addressing fan complaints, justified or otherwise. They also seemingly took some time to solve a few of the engine issues, allowing for both 13.2 and in particular Lightning Returns to be far more open than the original game. If we're gonna talk about the sequels to Final Fantasy XIII, the best place to start is probably with how they even unraveled the ending of 13 enough to create space for a sequel. Interestingly, I feel like this was done solidly enough, despite the use of time manipulation to get there. So at the end of Final Fantasy XIII, the fal'Cie of Cocoon are looking to meet the Maker, the god that created them. So their plan is to create enough destruction that their creator shows back up. Interestingly, there are actually multiple Makers in the 13 universe set up in a bit of a hierarchy. First would be the creator of the Cocoon fal'Cie, Lindsay, then the creator of Grand Pulse's fal'Cie, Pulse. There is a third goddess among these, whose realm is timeless and offers the ability to manipulate or oversee time as a whole, and who is also the seed from which humans were created, and who guides the souls of the dead out of the chaos and back toward the world to be reborn. Her name is Etro, and then above them all is the original creator Bunavelza, who made Pulse, Lindsay, and Etro himself. Bunavelza will become important later, but for now, Etro is the one that matters. Due to the circumstances of her creation that we won't get into, Bunavelza tried to sterilize Etro's creation by offering her no special powers of her own. She's almost like a rejected god. In her loneliness, Etro tears apart her physical form, which is then used to create humans. They are then infused with souls from the chaos, giving them their humanity and allowing her to find said souls when they return to the chaos, so that they can be reborn as mentioned before. What's more, thanks to humans having been created from her flesh, it turns out Etro does have some sort of powerful influence over them, despite Bunavelza's rejection and sabotage. And thankfully, being so comparatively undivine means that Etro is more empathetic to humans and can find true compassion much easier than Lindsay or Pulse. How this ends up manifesting in 13.2's story is with the creation of the first human, Yule, and a man that is eventually tasked with protecting her, Caius. Yule is made in Etro's image, and has the power to look up and down the current timeline whenever a major event drastically changes the future. Caius grows extremely protective of the Yule he's eventually born to guard. As with all Yules before her, Caius's Yule loses her life when she's seen enough changes in the timeline, and then is reborn as a new Yule, repeating the short cycle of her life for the rest of history. This kills Caius inside, as all he wants is to keep her safe, but he knows his life is finite and he won't be reborn as the same person like Yule will. So, Etro gives him her own immortal heart, allowing Caius to live and stay with Yule forevermore, protecting her. The problem? Watching one person he truly cares for die as a child for thousands and thousands of years takes its toll on Caius. Frustration and hatred grows in him because every Yule is special to him in their own unique ways. Despite all of them being Yule, every Yule is an individual person with her own hopes, dreams, hobbies, fears, and more. The narrative suggests she's a tool. Caius attempts to prove otherwise. Caius eventually decides that he wants to end this cycle. Hundreds of years after the end of Final Fantasy XIII, the world is ending. Few humans are left, Caius and Yule being two of them. Caius has seen thousands of years of time, and he has been alongside countless Yules who could also see how the timeline changed. Plans of revenge have brewed within him for a long, long time. He wants to kill Etro with the destruction of her heart in his body, freeing himself from his immortality and unleashing all of the chaos housing souls, releasing it into the world and destroying it. Unfortunately, the man Caius tasked with ending his life, Noel Kreis, is unwilling to kill his friend when so few humans are left, and when the current Yule cares for him so much. So Caius uses Etro's heart to make it to her realm, Valhalla, which serves as the gate between the living world and the afterlife. Knowing Caius has turned on her, Etro makes another risky decision, which is where the ending of 13 comes in. Lightning led the group that saved Cocoon and Pulse from destruction at the hands of Cocoon's fal'Cie. She is arguably the only human who has ever lived that is strong enough to face Caius. So Etro takes Lightning away to Valhalla and turns her into the goddess's protector. Lightning can see the whole timeline from Valhalla and immediately understands, beginning her fight with Caius. Unfortunately, this choice by Etro massively changes the timeline, with everyone believing that Lightning got stuck in the Crystal Pillar with Fang and Vanille to hold up Cocoon from falling. Caius staves off Lightning's attacks long enough to further distort time, creating a bunch of paradoxes that lead to a timeline which benefits his goals. So Etro also brings Noel, now the last human alive at the end of the world since Yule died and Caius left, to Valhalla. Lightning gives him instructions to find Sarah and asks him to fix the paradoxes Caius created with her. And so, Noel shows up a few years after the events of 13, meets Sarah, confirms that Lightning isn't in the Crystal Pillar and is instead waiting for Sarah in Valhalla, and the two set off to fix the paradoxes. That might sound very confusing as a way to undo 13's ending enough to allow for a sequel, but it's important to know that 13.2, similar to 13, starts with a cold open. All of what I just explained is the story of 13.2, on top of the adventures Sarah and Noel have across the different timelines. It isn't front-loaded, but instead Sarah and Noel learn all of this in bits and pieces over the game, which slowly explains what Lightning's doing, Etro's goals, and most importantly, Caius's goals. I like that this trilogy really puts a lot of emphasis on the mythology of the world, particularly in 13.2 and Lightning Returns. Final Fantasy often deals with gods, but it rarely feels as chaotic and fantastical as the real mythologies for things like Norse and Greek gods. The 13 trilogy channels this, and it works well since these games are primarily about themes and characters. The way 13-2 and Lightning Returns build off of 13 are the perfect modern example of why continuity isn't a necessary part of good storytelling, depending on the type of story you're trying to tell. A lot of it is told with the relative chaos of real-world mythology, simply with human characters stuck in the middle of it. And for me, I think it's rather fun and works well with the tone each game is trying to have. A lot of the time, the chaos of these mythologies in real life are what make them interesting, and I don't think it's wrong for a modern storyteller to try and do the same. Final Fantasy XIII really was about the characters, and 13-2 leans into that while using the mythology as a backdrop. The relationship between Noel, Yule, and Caius is one of the best in the series if you ask me, and that's due in no small part to the voice acting and how the game effectively captures the solitude of being one of the last humans at the end of a dying world. It also does a great job at humanizing Caius, despite his stoicism. His motivations make a lot of sense, and aren't overtly evil as is usually the case in Final Fantasy titles. Despite many of the other villains in the series having nuance in their stories, they usually do eventually submit to pure hatred and let it consume them. Caius, by contrast, has let love become his obsession, and that is what devoured him. He doesn't hate the world for how Yule was used, he hates the circumstances she's forced into by fate and wants to destroy Etro to free Yule from it all. Yes, the world is collateral, but what worth is a world devoid of life anyway? It's still evil, but it's certainly unique within the series. I think the game does a rather great job at showing both his love for Yule and the numbness it has impressed upon him. One of my favorite moments in the entire series is when Caius stressed the uniqueness of each Yule. You legitimately believe he remembers every single one of them and all of their unique qualities. Yes, he may come across as mostly cold when he has to lay yet another one to rest, but it's not through indifference. It's because a piece of him dies along with her, and as such, you can truly believe it when he rejects Noel's contrasting optimism. He's been there many times, mourning Yule in that way and trying to find compromise with a fate that she can't escape is beyond his reach now. All he can do is try to end the suffering. He can't take seeing her own optimism being snuffed out before she reaches her potential anymore. Caius is my personal favorite villain in the series for reasons like this, on top of the stellar character design and voice acting, of course. Noel and Sarah also make a good team. Both of them are relative straight shooters, but they have enough chemistry to feel like a logical duo, and while I can totally see people finding Mog annoying, I think Mog rounds them out well. Particularly after you get the ability to throw Mog, the corresponding quips from the little Moogle are adorably funny. Surprisingly, the time travel here is fun and rewarding too, whether it makes sense or not. I feel like a lot of people complain about time travel just because it's cool to do so. In 13-2 though, it's not just a plot device, it is the plot, and said plot explores the idea thoroughly in fun ways that aid the thematic focus. Remember that this is a story about characters, themes, and emotion sold through melodrama, not just the events that happen. Continuity clearly isn't the main purpose, and as such, despite the complexity, the storytelling here is different from something like Kingdom Hearts' more esoteric and convoluted plots and backstories. It feels consistent in its tone and feel, and doesn't get bogged down in exposition dumps about technical ideas unless explicitly channeling that technobabble trope in reference to sci-fi greats of the past. And it's written cleanly enough that even if you can't wrap your head around the time travel shenanigans very well, you still have clarity when it comes to the relationships and motivations for Noel, Yule, Caius, and Sarah. Interestingly, 13-2 explores and exploits a multitude of different types of time travel. In another story, these might be incongruous. When a certain magical wizard in his third year of school realizes that he was always destined to travel through time because it was an unchanging, closed loop, it then becomes a mess when decades later his son breaks this continuity to change time multiple times. But that's because the continuity of events and the rules of time travel in said story, written by a bigot, mattered to the story. So when they were changed by someone else later, it matters. 13.2, by contrast, is clearly supposed to be light and flippant with its time travel rules. It's supposed to be a buffet of time travel tropes and mechanisms, used specifically for the purpose of having fun with time travel itself. And the great thing is that each individual use of time travel mechanics is kept rather separate, so that it works almost more like an episodic television show. This time there's a focus on multiverse stuff, then closed loops, then open loops across an individual timeline. All sorts of different paradoxes are present. It's fun. That's the point. If time travel supposedly sucks nearly every time a story tries to take it seriously, then I feel it's worth reveling in 13.2's choice to throw caution to the wind and just splash and play around in it instead. Use it for feel, for theme, for aesthetic, and then use those themes to reinforce your human story about love, loss, and loneliness in a world you have no power to change. A story that ends in failure. I also therefore like the ending where Sarah dies. She too has been given the powers of Yule, so that they know when they've corrected toward an ultimate timeline where the world shouldn't end as it did in Noel's present. But these powers come at the same cost as they do for Yule. It's a fun cliffhanger, and I like how the hopeful music of the scene is intentionally undermined by her death. It captures a feeling of bittersweet success well, and slathers it in shock for the characters. Instead of melancholic grief as with your usual, "You go, I'll hold them off" style sacrifice, Sarah's death feels sharp and abrupt, like a disaster, or one that the characters are only just now realizing the weight of as she breathes her last breath. Some people can't get over the fact that it was quote-unquote sequel bait, but we already knew by the time the game released that they were creating a trilogy. Were you really tricked by a cheap cliffhanger if we were already told there'd be another game after that? That's kind of like complaining about Mass Effect 2 setting up Mass Effect 3. For me though, aside from the characters, the most successful part of 13.2's narrative is the feel of it all. While many parts can indeed be light and fun, or adventurous, there's this increasing cloud of dread that covers the story as it sprints on. There's this wonderfully palpable feeling of the world slowly unraveling. I think the ending exemplifies this. We feel like we're on the precipice of success, and then we fail. Caius gets what he wants. Chaos is unleashed and begins devouring the world. Sarah is dead. Yes, people have lived through it. The world won't become a giant pile of ash and dust. But in effect, they're all still dead. Nothing but the dark unknown lies ahead. This pressure, this dread, grows and grows, and I find it absolutely delightful. Lightning Returns will later continue from here by crafting a world that feels almost like a hopeless hellscape that it's your goal to salvage something from. It genuinely does give the impression that the death of everything is inevitable. The question is whether or not you can gather up enough of the pieces to build something new from the corpse. I feel like this is pretty unique in the series as well, both on 13.2 and Lightning Returns part. You don't feel in control of the world's fate in the same way as the other games. The gameplay is equally refreshing in 13.2, thankfully. While it continues directly on from the first game in the trilogy in most fundamental ways, there are a few key changes that actually led to some people who reviled 13 really enjoying 13.2. Firstly, let's fire through some of the most straightforward changes, many of which are in direct response to complaints people had in 13. Probably the most important change is that you don't get an immediate game over if your party leader dies. In the original game, I suspected they implemented such a choice because taking down every party member in 13 could often be an extraordinarily difficult task. In 13.2, however, you only have 2 human party members at any given time, and these are the only ones you can control. As such, you're given some leeway if one goes down, but not so much that you're basically invincible. This of course leads into the next change, which is that you can swap between Sarah and Noel at any time. Once again, it's pretty clear that they didn't want players exploiting such a system in the original game to avoid getting a game over if the party leader was about to bite it. And they didn't want you controlling every character at all times either, because the game was too fast. Up to 18 attacks going off in just a few seconds from your party on top of enemy actions is just too much to manage without AI party members. But similar to the previous change, only having 2 party members to control makes things easier to manage. So if only one of them has the saboteur role in your paradigm set, you can now switch, do what you need to do, and then switch back. To complement this, you can now set each paradigm in your deck of paradigms to either default each individual role to their standard targeting priorities, spread their attacks wide and emphasize multi-target options, or narrow their actions down to individual targets. Be careful with this though, because it affects healing and spells, not just raw targeting priority. So you may want to push a pair of commandos to focus in on the same target that your Ravager is targeting, but that also means the Ravager will only use single target spells unless manually told to do otherwise. Same with healing spells. This allows you to make one paradigm about multi-target heals and one about single-target heals, yes. But if used without thought, you could also find that you're wasting turns on cures for each individual party member when you could be using curas instead for more efficiency. And the reverse can also be true. Overall, it's a good addition, but one that has to be used with forethought and strategy in mind, otherwise your party members will feel significantly dumber than in the original game. The game also has difficulty options out of the box now, with easy altering how much HP enemies have, how easy they can be to stagger, how much damage you take, and even has wound damage heal over time, among other alterations. Wound damage is also new. Now, attacks can often permanently lower a target's max HP, which obviously will lower the effectiveness of healing for your characters over time. Wound damage heals after battles just like non-wound damage does, and you can use wound potions and a few other items to regain lost max HP. Wound damage generally only matters during fights with very powerful monsters, special monsters, or bosses, but it can genuinely put extra stress on the player at times in an engaging way, so I personally find it to be a welcome addition. Battles are semi-random now, which isn't necessarily something people were asking for, but it does allow the developers to include a way to punish players with true game overs, instead of just soft ones where you retry immediately. You see, every time a battle shows up, a timer shows up alongside them. Attack the enemy and you'll get a small advantage similar to a preemptive in the original game. Just run into them and nobody gets an advantage. However, if you try to avoid the battle and can't get away fast enough, you'll be locked into the battle. If this happens and you can't overcome the foe, you have to reload your last save. This is a pretty solid compromise between the people who actually enjoy super brutal punishments like that, and the people who just want to strategize and try again. The Crystarium was also overhauled for 13.2, making the actual act of heading into the menus to level a more meaningful act. Firstly, the menu is worlds faster, since you don't have to hold the button to fill each level with CP, but also, every role only has 99 levels, and you can access basically all roles pretty swiftly. Each character has a constellation assigned to them, which holds the leveling nodes. When you fill a constellation, you get the choice to unlock a new role, role bonus, ultimate ability, ATB segment, or give your character more points for equipping accessories. Then, the constellation resets to the next tier. This gives the player a ton of freedom for what they level, when, and how they grow. Your third party member will be unique in that they use materials to level instead, and some of them grow fast but peak quickly, while on the opposite end you have some that level slow but end up stronger by the time they're leveled up. Each of these party members, which we'll discuss more in a bit, only has one role, so they're comparatively straightforward and simple. Weapon and accessory upgrading was similarly altered, though the goal was to drastically simplify it. Now you upgrade weapons and accessories in shops. What you need is a bit of gil, the previous version of the weapon, and one or two material types. With weapons, this will boost the attack and magic of it, and often level up its special ability, which are just as useful here as in the original game. Accessories can either be upgraded to be more powerful but cost more, known as being durable, or they can be made delicate, which makes them weaker but they cost less in your accessory capacity. You can only equip what your max capacity currently allows, obviously, which makes accessories a bit less valuable this time around, since it can be pretty difficult to stack yourself with more than maybe 2 at a time. It's an interesting change to the system, but one that I think was a tiny step back in search of balance that I don't think was necessary, but maybe I'm missing something. The 2 biggest changes, though, are to the actual game pacing and structure, and that third party member we talked about earlier. First, the structure. 13 was pretty linear, as everyone knows. It wasn't necessarily more linear than the games before it, and once it opened up around the same time as all the other games do when you get the airship, it had more new content to do than pretty much all of them. The problem was that 13 greatly restricted what roles and party configurations you could use until the point where it opens up, and that it didn't allow for backtracking or very many ways to rest away from dungeon exploration. Nearly every area during the first 10 or so chapters was just a prolonged dungeon, with combat, and more combat, interspersed with cutscenes. 13.2, by contrast, is about time travel. Its overview map is literally a timeline with nodes across it, and as such, these nodes splay out, giving players a lot of options. There are several times and areas that are more or less completely optional unless you're going for 100% completion, and you can poke around in places much earlier than the story asks you to if you explore thoroughly enough. Eventually, you can even unlock fun paradox endings by redoing certain parts of the game and usually decimating a boss that you're supposed to lose against, or making a choice that runs counter to logic. Each area is largely designed to be non-linear. While they're often based on areas in the original game, they're treated less like a journey from one side to the other and more like pockets of environments to dig around in. Every area is then filled with quest givers, both optional and mandatory, as well as secret fragments to find. Fragments are the main MacGuffin here. And the developers added a bespoke jump button to give the traversal a bit of freedom. This, combined with the glide ability you can get later, can even be used to skip around in the final dungeon, which is super rewarding. It's very hands-off. You'll return to most places in different eras, giving you the opportunity to see how they've changed, and maybe explore new bits that were previously inaccessible. All of this comes together to create a game that's rather satisfying to explore and feels like it gives the player a wealth of choices and an even greater wealth of secrets. In a way that channels the stacked design of the original game, the other major shift in design sits right on top of this world design, adding yet more intrigue to push you to explore. That would be your third party member, which is actually always, or almost always, a monster. Yes, 13.2 is also basically Pokemon. Nearly every area in the game has a wealth of monsters to collect. Each has their own role in combat, moveset, growth, and special ability. They can all be decorated with goodies, named, and slotted into paradigms, and you can have 3 monsters in your party at once. Every time you kill a tameable monster, there's a chance you'll get its monster crystal. What's more, you can then take monsters and let others consume their essence, which can give them extra passive abilities. While you can only have 1 crystal for each monster at a time, and some of them are special hidden monsters who can only be obtained once, technically, kind of. For most monsters, you can simply fight more of them to obtain another crystal. Every area also has specific conditions or areas where monsters may spawn, which makes finding a new enemy invigorating each time. You never know what you'll find and how you can use them, and letting others gain passive abilities from them can turn some already powerful monsters into absolute gods. There really are endless possibilities here, and their Feral Link special abilities can genuinely be used to build whole strategies around if you want. 13.2 also includes a host of minigames for the people who missed those, like chocobo racing, slots, and quicktime events and cutscenes. And interestingly, if you don't want to do these quicktime events, you're allowed to just straight up skip the cutscenes involving them, which was very thoughtful on the part of the developers, since being forced to watch cutscenes just because you have to press buttons in them in other games can be insanely tedious. But it would be extra tedious here considering you have to redo some bits for for paradox endings. There are also a ton of anomalies you can fix by solving a few really clever but simple puzzles. There are ones where you have to collect a bunch of crystals with each square you step on disappearing once you walk away from it. There are ones where you have to create a constellation by running around and connecting similar crystals in time. And probably the most challenging is a clock puzzle where each spot has a different number. You can click on any number the two hands of the clock are currently facing. The hands will then convene there, and then move a number of spaces away in the opposite direction, corresponding with the number you chose. The goal is to remove every number without both hands landing on already used spaces at the same time. Some of these are brutally difficult, particularly when the numbers are randomized and they're timed. Every puzzle is completable, but they can really stump your brain. If you're smart, you'll spend a lot of time in the pause screen. If you're smarter and lazy, you'll just use one of the clock puzzle solving tools online. As you find fragments, you can gain access to a multitude of extra abilities, called fragment skills. One of them is the aforementioned glide added to your jump, but there are also others like double CP, fewer enemies, more enemies, rarer enemies appear more often, etc. Music, sound effects, visuals, and the overall aesthetic are great too. While performance is kinda shit no matter the platform you're on, even on PC with optimization mods, unless maybe you have a monster rig, or you're on Xbox One X or Series X. The game still looks wonderful regardless, just like the original. Each area has really nice visuals, and they do a great job of dressing them up for different time periods, so that they still feel kinda fresh upon these alternate time revisits. Meanwhile, I personally like the music even more than the first title. It has a lot more ethereal and synthetic of a quality, but it's often paired with bubbly, soothing vocals. This is a case where a JRPG uses vocals regularly, but uses them correctly. While I love Persona's music, hearing the first minute of a song with very prominent and boisterous vocals for 80 hours of battles isn't a great use of said music. Here, the vocals are both generally understated and or are used in songs where the vocals simply don't come up that often. The DLC is also pretty solid, if you're into its gimmicks and ideas. One DLC is a story about Saz, where he's stuck gambling in serendipity. I'm not really going to talk much about this, because while Chronobind is an interesting card game and I love Saz, I'm really not into gambling stuff as minigames most of the time. Another DLC has you playing as Lightning in Valhalla, fighting against Caius. This almost in a way feels like a precursor to Lightning Returns. In this DLC, your goal is to obviously fight and defeat Caius. However, every time you win or lose, you're ranked based on how well you did, you gain experience, and then you try again. Leveling up drastically strengthens Lightning, adds new paradigm roles and new abilities to those roles. She only has 10 levels before she's maxed out, and you want to try and defeat Caius at as low of a level as possible. This DLC somehow keeps up the pace in spite of only having one character. It really pushes you to constantly swap roles for bonuses, damage avoidance, etc., since Lightning has just a few items each attempt as her only options for healing. Definitely rewarding and even more enjoyable if you're the type of person who likes to push themselves, since once you beat Caius the first time, you can choose to make Lightning any level you want before you take him on again. And the last set of DLC content comes from the Colosseum, where a multitude of characters and enemies from previous games show up to do battle. Time travel, right? You've got Gilgamesh, Poo-Poo, Ultros and Typhon, Lightning and her old lieutenant Amadar, and several more. These battles are extremely challenging. Pretty much all of them are even harder than Rasputil, the major superboss in the base game. They all have unique gimmicks to their design that keep you on your toes and push you to get creative with your strategies. But on top of that, each of them allows you to obtain characters as monster crystals, as do the other two DLC. This means you can make your third character everything from Saz to Knight of Etro Lightning or Final Fantasy XIII Lightning, Omega Weapon, Amadar, Snow, whose Colosseum section is a bit special, and even Gilgamesh. Each of them has a rare chance of dropping, but they're also some of the most powerful monster options in the game. The difficulty of these battles can make it a bit tedious to unlock all of the monster crystals here though, considering the only way to make most of them quick and painless is to capture, level, and infuse several monsters into specific ones that get ridiculous stats when doing so. Otherwise, the low drop rate with a normal party who's completed everything else in the game can kinda be a nightmare. Your party in 13.2 doesn't get near as strong as you could in the original game, likely as a way to kind of rebalance things to keep late game growth from trivializing things, considering you can do so much content here in any order. They also changed things like the Saboteur role as a form of rebalancing. Saboteur abilities are a lot harder to land in 13.2, which makes them less spammable. While spamming them was accounted for in 13, it was also kind of a ubiquitous strategy because of that. You wanted to have the applicable debuffs up at all times on most strong enemies. The role is still useful enough to be valuable in 13.2, but from a game feel perspective, it can feel like shit to literally spend minutes trying to survive long enough to simply land poison or whatever, which pushes you to not rely on them too much, and often to wait until the chain percentage is super high, or even until the enemy is staggered, to even use it. Sarah and Noel also have far fewer options than party members in the original game. Most of the staple abilities are there, of course, but clearly the developers here didn't want you to have a perfectly rounded party at all times. They wanted you to experiment with different monsters, based on the things they do that Sarah and Noel can't, as well as in what order you decide to unlock their roles, abilities, etc. What's more, monsters can have abilities that weren't even in the original 13, giving them more uniqueness on top of their aforementioned feral links. This all creates a really interesting party building question, where you have to balance the current stage Sarah and Noel are at with the monsters you have access to, their roles, abilities, level, and even whether or not they're early peakers, balanced, or late bloomers. You can genuinely get some incredibly powerful monsters very quickly out of early peakers, but eventually the late bloomers will push them out of the spotlight, particularly if they have more desirable abilities. Sarah and Noel also still get their own unique abilities that consume all of their ATB, just like everyone did in 13. However, this time they're only usable once per battle, which shifts the strategy away from being a core pillar of the fight like Army of One, Cold-Blooded, or Death, and more toward the golden bullet you'll wait to fire until it'll be the most effective. As such, the balance of the game as a whole is probably a bit less polished than the original 13, thanks to the sheer number of monsters you can choose from. But it's also more concise because nobody is a jack of all trades, and most stats don't climb into the stratosphere. And even then, that still makes it a more balanced experience than most games in the genre, and the Final Fantasy series by default, as I explored when we looked at 13 itself. All of this being said, there's still a few things in 13.2 that really irked me. 13.2 as a whole is a surprisingly concise game. It doesn't expect a billion hours out of players so they can finish a bunch of tedious nonsense. While a lot of what you're doing isn't particularly complex, and often are just fetch quests or light puzzles, only a few bits really overstay their welcome. The slots in Serendipity are by far the worst part, because they're rigged. The machine has moods which affect the chance that you'll succeed with each pull, and while it's cool that you can level the machine up into more rewarding phases, it's not enjoyable to spend hours just putting coins in, pulling the lever, watching it go, and repeating just to get fragments or achievements. I wish there was something mechanical that the player could do to raise the odds significantly, like completing a side quest or some special machine pacing you could employ. The chocobo racing is a good example of how to do this well, because even though the racing itself is mediocre, it's cool that leveling your chocobo for battles also makes it better for racing, as does the type of chocobo you use. Instead, succeeding in slots all depends on whether you're manually or automatically doing pulls, whether you have a specific key item in your inventory, and what mood the machine is in. No thought, just get the right settings and zone out into frustration. The other pain points are the academia quizzes. These are fun in theory, but you have to search out the terminals and characters to take the quizzes like an Easter egg hunt. There are a few trick questions and gimmick questions, and many of the questions don't offer answers in-game, or require the data log to learn the answer to, which you can't access during the quiz. And if you get even one question wrong, you have to start all the way over with the questions being randomized from large pools each time. It means you either use a guide or just beat your head against the wall guessing for ages, which sucks because the questions that are rewarding to know answers to are legit enjoyable. These two issues suck, because the game only takes between 50 and 70 hours to 100%, and basically everything else is completely fair and in the player's control. Other issues are more minor but still an annoyance. Augusta Tower has areas that are too cramped, basically forcing encounters on you. Same with Academia 400 AF, which basically doesn't allow you to run from battles with Seath, despite the fact that no Seath offers a monster crystal, so they're just a waste of time for a pittance of CP. The map also isn't the greatest, thanks to its inability to show verticality properly. You'll likely get used to it, but it can really make the more labyrinthine locations a bit tedious, like Academia. The final dungeon, meanwhile, is an okay idea, and as I said before, I like that you can kind of cheese it with cleverly timed jumps, but it also has some super rough encounters that are more or less forced on you, and there's a lot of waiting around for pathways to move into position. Still, it seems more confusing than it actually is. And lastly, while it's a rewarding fight, the final boss is extremely long-winded and tough unless you're overleveled. It wasn't unenjoyable to do, but I did lose after nearly 40 minutes my first time, necessitating that I started all the way over. Once I set myself up better, it took something like 25 minutes, and then beating it again with all of the fragments for the extended ending was cake. But it is worth noting that you really don't want to go into the fight unprepared. All that being said though, there honestly isn't much that's wrong with 13.2. Could I see a better version of the game in another timeline? Yeah. Do I wish that its performance didn't suck ass? Hell yes. But it's a really solid as hell experience for what it tries to accomplish, and I'd honestly argue it's one of the best games in the series. Yes, really. If you hated 13 for the gameplay, try 13.2 and see if it works better for you. You may just find something to love. I know I did. Now, all that's left is Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII. Drastic changes lie ahead, and how will Tri-Ace tackle them and wrap up the trilogy? Time will tell. The good thing is, I'm a time traveler now that I've played 13.2, so we don't have to wait to hear about Lightning Returns. If I have all the footage of 13 already from earlier this year, why not just do 13.2 and Lightning Returns back to back? So let's just leap straight into the closing part of the trilogy. If you've played through 13 and 13.2 by this point, you might be wondering exactly how Lightning Returns plans to carry on from the end of the last game. Chaos was unleashed when the Heart of Etro was destroyed, Valhalla collapsed into the mortal realm, Sarah died, and nobody had any idea what to do. Well, it turns out that the world is pretty big, go figure. So it'll take quite a while for Chaos to envelop everything. Several hundred years, in fact. During this new era, thanks to Etro's powers over time no longer existing and Valhalla merging with the world, time itself has stopped for humans. They can still die from sickness or damage to their vital organs, but they won't age or die from said age. What's more, everyone is now sterile, so nobody new can be born. Children stay children, with the brain of a child, and yet they still gain the boundless experience that you would after living for several hundred years. Lightning, at the end of 13.2, is encased in crystal. She chooses to do this in response to Sarah's request that she simply be remembered. Sarah doesn't regret Lightning's request that she fix the timeline, because even if it didn't work out and led to her death, it was worth it to her. So Lightning uses her powers to become indestructible crystal to hold Sarah's memory and soul safe. No matter what else happens in existence, Sarah will be remembered. And yet, hundreds of years later, Lightning finds herself turned back to normal, as are Vanille and Fang, unbeknownst to her. Lightning learns that this was done by the god of all gods, the true maker, Bunavelza. Bunavelza has made contact with Hope as well, illuminating his plan to finally destroy the world and start anew. With this goal in mind, the god needs a savior. Once again, Lightning is chosen for such a lofty goal, and Hope is to be her support. Bunavelza's motives aren't completely pure, however. There are only a handful of days left before his plan will start its final steps, and the world will be extinguished. While Lightning's goal is to save as many souls as possible during this time, what she doesn't know is that Bunavelza plans to leave behind every soul that has already been lost to the chaos, the millions and millions of souls of the dead. They are not worthy of this new paradise. What's more, Bunavelza has grown tired of being unable to see into the chaotic hearts of humans, and wants to mold them in his own vision, where he can control them and ensure his paradise stays as such. Unbeknownst to Lightning, both her and Hope have been tampered with as well. One thing that the original 13 explores lightly is the death of Lightning's parents. She had to grow up quickly, and repressed a lot of her feelings of grief so that she could be strong for Sarah. She eventually changes her identity from Claire Farron to Lightning, and joins the Guardian Corps, hardening her even further. But Claire and all of those repressed feelings are still in her heart. That is, until Bunavelza awakens her. Since Sarah's soul doesn't belong in Lightning's body, it escapes as soon as she's uncrystallized, taking these repressed feelings with. The abundance of chaos allows them to coalesce and manifest into a new, temporary being known as Lumina. Despite being repressed, these feelings still manifested as part of Lightning's personality in previous games. But now that they're gone, similar to Hope, who has been molded into the perfect mouthpiece for Bunavelza and been made young again, partially to get Lightning to trust him more since that's the Hope she knew. Lightning is now strangely devoid of most emotion. It's like a part of her heart has been ripped out, because in essence it has been. Lumina, meanwhile, seems to be rather feisty, mocking Lightning, and often tampering with her goals in ways that occasionally feel questionable, but always eventually help Lightning to do her job as savior in the end. Once you know Lumina's deal, her behavior ends up seeming kinda sad, because it suggests this is what Lightning was like before her parents died, and she had to rush to grow up. And the visual design of Lumina suggests that Lightning and Sarah were inseparable, and got along really well. Lightning then lost her innocence, but did everything she could to protect Sarah's, which is why Sarah is much more outgoing and optimistic. She took after the young, lively Lightning, and never had to toss away her own innocence. Anyway, to keep Lightning compliant, Bunavelza tries to trick her with illusions of Sarah, but ultimately this facade doesn't hold up to the influence of the real Sarah within Lumina, allowing Lightning to see the truth. In the end, Lightning learns of Bunavelza's trickery thanks to Lumina, and is able to save all of the lost souls in the chaos from being destroyed. She then uses the powers given to her by Etro, her powers gifted by Bunavelza, and her unique powers as a human to take Bunavelza down, saving Hope's soul in the process. After Bunavelza learned the lost souls were saved, he planned to destroy the paradise he was already creating as punishment, but Lightning was able to get to him in time to stop it. This allowed the paradise to finish, and all of their souls to make their way there, both lost and saved. Firstly, I really enjoy the tone of this game. While there is a sort of complacent comfort in this slowly rotting world, since the people have obviously gotten used to 500 years of timeless existence, there's also still a really palpable feeling of chaos. This really does feel like the end of the world, complete with an air of destructive presence, like it's ending in slow motion. It can be agonizing. Most people are done surviving. They've chosen to live instead, even if it means they die before the end of time and before their soul is saved. That delirium and exhaustion with life simply lived comes through rather strongly, and melds well with the undercurrent of panic and fear that chaos will soon consume everyone and everything. The ending also seems to suggest that the new world that's ultimately being made for everyone is actually Earth, which I always thought was a nice, goofy touch. A lot of people took it too seriously because they've gotten the canon is everything stick shoved so far up their ass that they can't simply enjoy something, but realistically it doesn't impact anything, especially since it's never 100% confirmed in-game that it is Earth. So I like that it's there, but it's not obtrusive. And as with 13.2, I really like that there's a heavy reliance on lore and mythology from the first two games. It once again feels like mythology turned real, and feels like it builds upon what 13 set up in the background, and then 13.2 revealed behind the curtain. This is even less a story about humans, and even more a story about gods, which is fun. The story ideas overall are pretty nice. They flow well, they fit the themes well, and they're well explored. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean they're without problem. Two core problems, really. The first major problem is just how exposition heavy the game is. Unfortunately, there's a lot the game needs to go through, and a lot of mystery, which it can't easily explore and reveal in natural conversation or scene direction. Well, some of this works thanks to the fact that Lightning and Hope are supposed to be lacking in emotion, and because they're treated almost kind of like detectives in a lot of situations, there's still a wealth of simple information regurgitation. Thankfully, it's usually done through conversations while exploring and playing, rather than in cutscenes, so it's not like they're stopping everything to dump lore on you or something, unlike a series like Kingdom Hearts. But it still could be better. Conveniently, though, that brings us to the other major problem, which comes down to motivations and characterization. Yes, 500 years have gone by since we last saw most of these characters, and there are some nice bits, like Snow's section, or what little characterization Saz gets, but then you have characters like Noel, who feel like a great idea, but end up a half-baked mess, or Caius, who doesn't have any depth at all anymore. Lightning is the core of the story. These characters are treated more like cameos, but given the amount of emphasis they have, there should be a little bit more to them. Noel is probably the more frustrating of the two, because you can see what they were going for. Madness and self-loathing has torn him apart after Sarah's death. He was unable to protect any of the people he said he would, whether that be Caius, Yule, or Sarah, and he's had hundreds of years to stew over this. Not to mention frustration from the fact that Snow doesn't blame Noel for Sarah's death, even though he feels he should. I wanted Noel to find rage, hatred, and destruction through this pain, to, in essence, start down the path that Caius did as a great parallel. I wanted him to have done the things people in Luxurion accuse him of, killing women with pink hair who are supposed to be the savior, and I wanted it to be revealed that he obviously wasn't dumb enough to assume the savior would be anyone other than Lightning, but he couldn't stop himself from taking his anger out on others anyway. I wanted him to blame Lightning for everything. Maybe that's too dark, but simply going with a prophecy that says he's destined to kill Lightning, and then that just not happening, feels weak. Yes, it resonates with the original 13's themes of defying fate, and it doesn't make him irredeemable, whereas my alternate version very well might, if not handled well. But he also wasn't even in the original 13, and while his story was about defying fate, it was never in question that he could. The only fate he couldn't defy was that of the Seeresses. And maybe that's enough for others, but for me, this section felt more and more clunky as it continued. He just lacked the proper amount of rage and insanity for someone who spent 500 years believing he was the cause of all the pain and suffering for those he'd once cared for. A strange issue, considering they'd handled that very thing so well with Caius in 13.2. Caius was so enraged that he became cold. It was too much to feel, so he didn't. He just acted. And unfortunately, none of that matters here. I loved the idea that Caius would have some massive presence in Lightning Returns. He was such a great villain in 13.2 that I wanted him to be a serious threat here, and for him and Lightning to clash one more violent time. But he's two-dimensional here. Caius feels like there's no saving someone such as himself. He's not allowed to leave Etro's ruined temple, the Yules he knew keeping him there. He claims that some want his suffering to continue so he can pay for the things he's done, and that others want his suffering to end. The one interesting thing he does during his main questline is remind us that each Yule is a unique individual, despite all of them looking similar and having the same fate. When Lightning defeats him, he quietly decides the best way for him to respect Yule's collective memory and make some sort of attempt at atonement is to shepherd the souls lost in the chaos toward the new world. When he reaches this point, he decides to make the position permanent, while Yule takes up the position of the god of death. Together, they can collect the souls of the dead in the new world and guide them back to the world to be reborn. While this is a fitting end for Caius, he just lacks any form of presence here. Once again, there's not much sense of the toll these 500 years have put on him, which just isn't very fun, considering how wonderful he was to watch previously. Particularly since he was a main villain, I feel like he deserved a bit more spotlight here, which he just didn't get. Lightning also has a problem that I'm of two minds on. As I said, part of the story here, which pulls from the original game in 13.2, is that Lightning has been stripped of most of her ability to express emotions. This is an interesting idea for sure, and it's fantastic that it draws from her entire arc, instead of being a new issue she randomly has to deal with. The symbolism is fantastic. However, it's also an extremely difficult choice to write around. Having your main character be emotionless can make it difficult to emphasize or connect with them, particularly when this is being hidden from the player as a mystery to reveal. But on top of this, it can also cause minor issues when she does show emotion. I don't think they did the best job navigating this challenge. She's not wholly different from her character in the original game, but she's just different enough that many players feel like she's bland and boring to play as here, and unfortunately the fact that it's intentional can't be justification alone. She still has to carry the story, which she does in most fundamental ways, just not in quite enough ways to pull everything together. I can also understand why people might not enjoy a lot of the world characters who give you quests, but I feel like they're more complex than you often get from generic side quest characters, and they generally fit the core themes of the world well. These stories are generally more human in nature, considering restoring their faith in life is kind of the core requirement for Lightning to be able to save them, which is probably a good place to transition into gameplay. The story in Lightning Returns is solid, and has a fun spin on the usurping the gods trope Final Fantasy often employs. It has issues, but it's a solid enough story. But the gameplay is the thing that makes it stand out the most, and the side quests are a big part of that. If I were to describe this game to anyone who hasn't played it yet, there's one comparison that immediately comes to mind. Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII is Square's Majora's Mask. I doubt I'm the first person or even the zillionth person to make that comparison, but it is true. While Lightning Returns doesn't revolve around repeating the same cycle over and over to make progress, it's a game that's heavily reliant on the world, side plots, and time management in large open areas in order to progress. The world is split up into several large, unique, and open areas that are all rather rewarding to explore, offer secrets to find, and offer unique gameplay gimmicks to keep you company. The Dead Dunes, for example, is mostly completely open, which means traversal is easy, especially if you utilize dune sliding to save stamina for sprinting. But it also means enemies can have a much easier time getting to you, because there are no obstacles allowing for easy escape if you run out of stamina. Similar to Majora's Mask, a lot of characters recognize that the world is coming to an end soon, and if they want their soul to be able to rest, they need to be able to reconcile with something that happened in their past. Some of these side quests are simple and goofy, others are bombastic, and still others are heartbreaking in their own way. Some of them don't require much engagement of time at all, others rely very heavily on being consistent each day, being on schedule when you're supposed to be somewhere, or even completing something quickly enough. Lightning Returns gives you around a week to start in order to complete as much content as you can, but the more you do, the more extra days you get, up to a total of 13. Go figure. Each day starts on the arc with Hope, where time doesn't move until you leave, and each day ends here as well. The world itself also sometimes has doors that will open or close at certain times, requiring that you go a different route or even schedule your actions for a certain time when an area is open to you. Unfortunately, the game doesn't have a day planner to schedule things in, which would be incredibly useful. This is because if you try to do everything, you're going to be juggling upwards of 3 to 10 quests at any one time. Technically, there are a very, very small handful of quests that can't be completed on your first playthrough, generally because they branch in a way that fails one quest while starting another. And there's one in particular that can only be completed after the person who gives it to you is no longer available to turn it into, necessitating that you talk to them in a second playthrough. The game clearly intends that you play through it multiple times, instead of trying to do everything in one go. But other than these few quests, you can more or less do everything on said initial playthrough. Most quests in Lightning Returns are fetch quests. Sometimes they require astute observation or problem solving though, which adds a bit of spice. Other times they're purely designed to test your ability to schedule and maintain that schedule. And still other times they put pressure on your ability to make the choices that the game deems best for that character. My favorites tend to be the ones that explore what it would be like to be alive for 500 years in a world that doesn't age but is slowly coming to an end. The ones that tackle adulthood in the body of a child because of this pause in time, and the ones that mirror Lightning's distance from her own emotions. While a fair amount of the quests are just goofy, random stuff, there are more than a few that try to tackle something deeper. They're not going to be the most comprehensive looks at a topic, but they also aren't in games like Majora's Mask, and I think that's okay. The rewards for these side quests, and quests in general, usually come in the form of stat upgrades, equipment, and cosmetics you can adorn Lightning with. And if you're really into the game, you'll be delighted to know that it adds new mechanics to subsequent playthroughs, related to upgrading things like your equipment or accessories. It even offers a hard mode in its New Game Plus that keeps up the challenge if you want to have access to a full suite of mechanics and equipment, but still have the game push you mechanically. About the only thing that doesn't gel well with this is the fact that the game is rather long if you try to do lots of side questing, so you'll probably want to split these playthroughs up across the years instead of putting them back to back. There are even two core ways to play through Lightning Returns that both offer a different way of managing the central scheduling structure. You can either choose to spam the EP ability, Chronostasis, or not spam it. Playing the game without spamming Chronostasis focuses heavily on just being as fast as possible with your actions. You need to be thoughtful with your routes and quick-witted with your solutions to problems. You'll also likely have more EP to use in battle, which will afford you more options there. Playing with regular use of Chronostasis instead asks you to route around the EP the enemies give you, quests that might require you to head into another area, which cancels Chronostasis and takes up some of your time, and what enemies you have available. You see, as you defeat enemies in Lightning Returns, they'll slowly run out. When you defeat enough of a certain type of enemy, a last one will appear, which is much stronger, gives you special items when you win, and gives you a bit of extra EP. But once they're dead, that enemy will no longer spawn. Do this to enough enemies in a high traffic area, and you'll find it hard to gain enough EP to keep Chronostasis up. This forces the player to better manage combat in a long-term sense so that you can have more access to EP refills for longer, but it also forces you to be more frugal with your usage of other EP abilities, and maybe even clever with how you use side quests that can give you infinite EP as long as you don't complete them. Not to mention, any enemy you fight when you have max EP is just a waste of that otherwise finite resource. While the former way of playing sounds significantly simpler, it really isn't. If anything, it's the harder way to play, but it still plays with the scheduling and time systems in a tangibly different way, allowing the player to make the playthrough their own. Meanwhile, the Chronostasis route requires that you use it at the right time. You can almost think about Chronostasis time as added hours, but using this wrong can lead to wasting these extra proverbial hours, wasting real in-game hours on top of that, wasting EP, and halting your schedule. It's not as easy as just spamming Chronostasis. The other thing that allows the player to make the gameplay their own is the combat and schemata system. Combat in Lightning Returns is almost exclusively done with only Lightning herself. As such, a lot more of the encounters are with only a single enemy. Generally, 3 enemies is where it tops out. The player now has some basic control over where Lightning moves, and camera control can be rather useful for ensuring you don't get surprised by an off-screen attack. While you might initially think that only having a single character with a few enemies to face at a time greatly simplifies gameplay, the paradigm system has effectively been transformed into something brand new. Now, Lightning has access to just 3 roles at once, known as schema, and all 3 of them are completely customizable, starting from the garb, or clothing, and going down. Your garb dictates the general feel and focus of the schema. Some offer more initial ATB or max ATB, some have much higher HP, others offer unique attacks or variations of attacks. Then, every schema can have a weapon, a shield, 2 different types of accessories, and up to 4 attacks equipped to it, which can be upgraded and transformed to become even stronger. There are no restrictions on the combinations you can create, meaning it's up to you to both make schema where every piece synergizes and to craft a trio of schemata that synergize in combat. There are a lot of options here, in every category, and most of them have legit uses in one type of build or another. What's more, theory crafting experts can really dig deep and come up with some insane schema. One example that a fair amount of players will undoubtedly come across is the ability to stack resistances to the point that a certain type of damage, magical or physical, literally can't damage lightning at all. This allows you to switch to this schema before massive attacks to negate them entirely, though that also comes with the caveat that it can't really do any damage. But it's still great for recharging the ATB of other schema quicker, which happens whenever they're in reserve, or casting debuffs and buffs while working on stagger. Just like 13.2, the player has the option to attack enemies on the field, which will do damage at the start of the battle, and now the game offers a different punishment for restarting if you fail, in the form of taking an hour off of your clock. Lightning Returns combat is pretty fast, and feels almost more like an action RPG than a turn-based one. It even incorporates timed guarding to both greatly push enemies towards stagger and greatly negate damage. Timing when you do attacks will also enhance the stagger potential of each hit. Some enemies take more damage when you hit a specific part of their body, and switching schema is so quick that you can use it much more effectively for complex combos or damage negation than ever before. Staggering, meanwhile, is less clear, but also much more varied in application. Not only can many enemies be staggered far quicker, but staggering can also be affected by weak points, can once again completely change the tactics of the enemy, and some enemies legitimately need to be staggered several times, pushing them through different phases. That being said, staggering is also a bit less important. It's a bit frustrating how unclear it can be, particularly when it's something specific like only attacking an enemy when its mouth is open or something like that. But because of the lack's importance, it still works out in the end, and staggering ends up being more viscerally gratifying on top of that. EP abilities in combat can definitely turn the tide if you use them well, as can items, which are much more limited this time around. Lightning has a small dock of slots to put items in, which can expand as you play, and you can't store extra items, meaning you have to remember to stock back up after you've used something. And that will almost certainly play a part in your playthrough, considering Lightning doesn't heal after battle anymore. So you either have to spend gil and time staying at an inn, spend gil and time heading to a restaurant for a meal, or use an item and remember to refill it later. All of this creates a different pacing and mechanical tone from the previous titles, which gives it a bit more of a survival edge and more of a focus on player expression. I feel like Lightning Returns is by far the least balanced of the trilogy, owing to the extra freedom the players afforded, but it's also the one that channels Final Fantasy VII style freedom of expression the best. If you didn't like how the previous 2 games restricted jobs, then this is the game for you out of the 3. That being said, the original 13 still definitely has the most difficult challenges as long as you're not grinding for hours and hours. But the toughest challenges in Lightning Returns take an extremely gratifying amount of strategy, thought, precision, and really punish not being on your A game. Honestly, there's not much more I can say about Lightning Returns that isn't self-evident. It's a relatively simple game when you get down to it, even though strategizing in it can be rewardingly complex. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if these games will ever get solid ports. At one point, it was something I felt was a no-brainer, but now that I've played the PC ports, I'm not so sure. Both because of the bad reputation of 13, and because of Crystal Tools, the engine they were made in. In particular, while you can technically run all of these games at higher frame rates on PC, at least 13.2 and Lightning Returns both have pretty severe issues. 13.2 struggles to hit anything close to 60 FPS on modern systems. While I don't have access to top-of-the-line hardware, it doesn't inspire confidence when the game bounces between 30 and 60 FPS at just 1080p on both a quad-core 7th Gen i5 with 8 gigs of DDR4 RAM and a GTX 1050, and a much more powerful system with a Ryzen 5 5600H with 6 cores and 12 threads, 16 gigs of faster DDR4 RAM, and an RTX 3060, as well as a PCIe Gen 3 NVMe SSD. I never get tired of saying this garbage. These may be mid-range setups from around 2017 and 2021 respectively, but we're talking about a game that came out on the PS3 and 360 in 2012. As for Lightning Returns, which came out 2 years later on the same hardware, the game can run rock solid at 1080p 60 frames a second on the GTX 1050 machine at all times, with an asterisk we'll get to in a moment. And it can likewise do 4K 60 on the RTX 3060 machine. However, there are certain areas where it lurches between around 40 and 60 FPS in rapid succession, almost as if it had double buffer VSync engaged, and was repeatedly trying to lock the game to 40 FPS due to poor consistency at 60 FPS. You can see this best in certain highly traveled areas of places like Yusnan or Luxurion. But once you leave these areas or enter a battle, the game runs perfectly locked at 60. This is not a normal performance problem, and it persists no matter what type of VSync you use and whether it's through the game or your NVIDIA control panel, even when you have VSync disabled entirely, at least on my hardware. What this problem seems to be in both games, manifesting in different ways, is a streaming stutter inherent in Crystal Tools, since it wasn't originally designed to handle open-level streaming well. This specific problem is potentially the main reason why the Luminous engine was created for Final Fantasy XV, since that game was supposed to be open world from the start. Well, if you look at even just the performance of the original 13 on Xbox 360 and PS3 when you get to Pulse, you'll see that it's not really good at handling open spaces. While Tri-Ace did do some things to better manage this, and seemingly improved the tech quite a bit, I don't think they were able to get rid of this stutter on any platform. You might think, as lame as it would be to do this with remasters of the trilogy, that you could just lock them to 30 FPS and call it a day. But unfortunately, the stutter, even on PC, persists at 30 FPS. At this point, we're talking about games running on tech that hasn't been used since 2014, almost 10 years ago, games that are nearly 13, 11, and 9 years old respectively. It might be too much to ask, considering the fanbase's collective frustration with the 13 trilogy, to expect that Square would be willing and able to either detach these games from Crystal Tools and port them to another engine without creating oddities and glitches along the way, or go back to technology none of them have likely touched in forever and figure out how to revitalize it for a modern era so that the streaming stutters are gone. Don't be mistaken, if they did do this, these games on PC show that they could run really well at extremely high resolutions and 60 FPS and hold up visually on modern console hardware. And if they include the higher resolution pre-rendered videos, it would be a truly delectable marvel that I, for one, would love to purchase. But these streaming stutters might be the Achilles heel that either lead to mediocre ports or no ports at all in the future. Obviously, as I said early on, I don't need to do near as much defending of 13.2 and Lightning Returns. Both are games that people were more receptive to than the original 13 for various reasons. That being said, people are still really rough on the stories, which I don't think makes a ton of sense a lot of the time. The key aspect to these two games that a lot of people seem to miss is that the sequels are designed to be loose and focus on themes and mythology, as previously established. 13 was comparatively a much more grounded game. but you had a lot of lore that felt super reminiscent of our own historical myths and dead religions hidden under the surface, which in a way guided the fallacy along in that story. 13.2 and Lightning Returns bring that mythology to life and tackle the chaos of real-world mythology better than any other game I've played. They channel how insane some of these stories are. You know, gods birthing other gods from their heads or trying to kill people, but they split into two and then they reproduce with one of them and have another kid who eats this other god or whatever. It's often pure lunacy. Most other games, even Final Fantasy, that deal with gods and mythology play them more like campfire stories and mundane, all-knowing figures that are either chill or just evil. You have gods that feel like all-powerful humans rather than unknowable gods. 13.2 and Lightning Returns tackle it in ways that are even a bit more mystical than games like Dark Souls at times. But that, and the focus on themes, requires readjustment of your mindset, both in regards to its relationship to 13 and game lore in general. And I think that ties in really well to the extra emphasis on themes and characters, and using their core conceits in whatever ways it feels are fun, and best highlight those themes and characters. The time travel in 13.2 doesn't make sense. Across the game, it uses basically every mutually exclusive form of time travel that has been popularized at one point or another. But that's the point. People hate time travel stories because they always try to make sense but never make sense. So 13.2 figured, why try to make sense of it then? And just threw every trope at the player in interesting ways that reinforce the feelings of a world that's rapidly deteriorating. And I think the game does an excellent job at that, making it feel like you're trying to build back up this sandcastle that's crumbling before your very eyes, and yet the sand is just too much to handle and it slips through your fingertips at every turn. Every single time the characters start to find footing and leverage, the world crumbles into yet more chaos, literally and figuratively, until eventually they lose. They don't lose in the way the cast of 6 arbitrarily loses in order to raise the stakes. They lose. Sarah dies, chaos is unleashed, time is no more, and the god of all gods has finally awoken to see what all the noise is. Even the beings we saw as gods in the first game couldn't summon Bunavelza through trying to crash their synthetic planet into the real planet below. It took the complete obliteration of time, unraveling of reality, and unleashing of the disgusting stench of chaos that he loathes so much to finally wake God up. As you would expect for a real mythological god who would rarely play by human logic or rules in their decisions. For me, that slippery slope of time, while also just having fun with stupid time travel shenanigans, and the great characters, really pulls 13.2 together into something different, but highly rewarding if you just get on its level. And Lightning Returns does the same thing, but emphasizes a world that is already doomed. Similar to how 13.2 feels like a world crumbling, Lightning Returns feels like a world that's dead, on life support but not really capable of being saved. Think about that. You can't save it. You're the savior and you can't save it. You get to watch the world die and hope that God, who has given you your powers, will actually use the souls you're gathering for something new. And that once again lends itself well to the exploration of this dying world. 500 years people have spent not aging, not breeding, but slowly dying, either through being consumed by the chaos or natural/violent means. Children have gained 500 years of experience and life, but still can't quite escape the ignorant, wistful nature of how a child's still developing brain sees the world. They're confused because they know the world isn't simple, but still don't quite have the cognitive consistency to face it. Adults who have buried themselves in guilt for dozens or hundreds of years. Others who have explored life so thoroughly that they simply can't wait for it to end because they're bored out of their minds. Monsters aren't even infinite anymore, and you can literally eradicate nearly every single type until the world is devoid of challenges not brought on by the humans that are trying to claw their way out. And then tying that into Lightning's long-running struggle with emotion, having to grow up so quickly for Sarah after their parents died, having effectively been given the power of gods 3 times now, further separating her from herself. She is the savior, working for God and heaven, and yet she struggles to even save herself. It's not perfect, mind you, neither game is, and Lightning Returns really fumbles characters like Caius up until the end. But damn if I don't love how hard they tried to buck traditional storytelling trends and focus on the craziness and chaos of what if time travel and god mythologies and the end of the world were all actually really happening, instead of using it as set dressing. Like, after these games, I've never quite seen stories about overcoming gods the same way again, because so many of them just make characters gods purely to maximize the stakes. How do you overcome something that is all-knowing, all-powerful, but is evil or ambivalent to the idea of doing good? Well, you somehow always do, purely by being factually, objectively, statistically more powerful than them. There's no playing with the concept of godhood. There's no alternative solution for saving the world that leverages mythology. You just literally become stronger than God and kill them. You do what 13 did, except 13 was clever enough to say, but in reality these gods are actually more like puppets to humanity. You can't even conceive of what real gods are yet. For me, someone who revels in alternative forms of storytelling that aren't just generic hero's journey, objective stories with reliable narrators, I greatly appreciate that 13.2 and Lightning Returns said, we could just up the ante, but we have this big data log full of poetry and complex lore and gods, all of which was intended purely to be flavoring for the narrative of the first game. Why don't we leverage this as if we're writing the Bible? I don't want, big God is bad God. I want, and then God talked to this person through a burning bush, and also flooded the world and had 2 naked people in a grove of apples they weren't supposed to eat, and was surrounded by rings of angels that just kind of sit there because that's fun, especially when it's not used to push agendas in real life, you know? If you ask me, the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy is at worst pretty solid, and when at its best, fantastic. It has a bad reputation for a multitude of reasons that I've discussed ad nauseum at this point, but I think it's worth a lot more than the most ardent haters give it credit for. I'm glad the games exist, and I've gotten literally hundreds and hundreds of hours of fun out of them. They've inspired me, not in a way that's totally unique to them. They weren't life-changing on their own, but they were pretty dang good and relatively creative and unique within the Final Fantasy series, you know? I'm happy with them and will enjoy going back to them every once in a while in the future. But what do you guys think? How do you feel 13.2 and Lightning Returns stand up next to the original game? Is there anything in particular you like about them that you feel stands out? And what about something you think stands out for the worst? Let me know in the comments below and I'll see you next time.